adults, and when they are asked why, one of the biggest reasons that they cite is because it's popular, that everybody's doing it, that they think it's safe, that it's only fruit juice. You know, there's nothing that can harm them, and they have misinformation, and they're guided a lot by peers, peer pressure, fitting in. It's the in thing, and as one of our partners said, the new shiny object. So it's really just blown up. These are some facts that you might already know that are in the first PowerPoint here, is that vaping and tools and paraphernalia are classified as tobacco as far as the ARS statute goes, as far as the legalities. So a person must be 18 and over. Did you know that they were categorized as tobacco products? So you got to be 18 and over in order to be in possession. So if you have a vape, and I'll pass some of the vaping paraphernalia out that we have here, and it's been confiscated so you can see it. But it's considered a petty crime. And then I believe Mesquite is the same. I know the Chandler School District has an automatic suspension if you are in possession of tobacco. So
is this considered tobacco?
It's considered tobacco. It's classified as tobacco. So a lot of the students don't even realize that, or some of them do. That's why they hide it. That just being in possession of it, they can get suspended. And then the school is supposed to call law enforcement, and then they reserve the right to either fill out the referral or not. But it is a referable offense. So just maybe being aware of that, knowing that, and providing some of these factual things that we have, providing these to the students as you witness or see. Also, I just wanted to cover, as we're talking to teachers, that some of the things that we have seen be a little more effective with helping maybe our young adults internalize why I should vape or why I shouldn't vape, or make some of these choices and decisions. Because that's really kind of what it boils down to, is they're either going to choose that they're going to do it or choose that they don't want to do it. Is to, just approach it from a position of asking them questions and make them think. And then saying, have you heard of these facts? And some of the things that Dr. Bogosh is going to present, I think, are huge when it comes to directing our students to even go on and Google it. Say, well, here's what a doctor told me that it does to the lungs. Google it and see, because I really care about your future, and some of the things that might affect you long term that can't be irreversible. So my part of it here before doctor talks is just kind of say, here's the legalities, here's what we're seeing in schools, and sometimes the direct pressures can work, the direct enforcements, but teachers have an opportunity through relationship to kind of use that relationship to make them think beyond the shiny object or the new popular thing, and give them a perspective of seeing more of a vision, right? Can we go to let's go ahead and go to the second one. I think you have this with you. These, once again, are just some stats that show the rise of use in the 8th graders, I think the 10th graders, and the 12th graders. So the next two are just kind of backing up what I said with some statistics. I did bring some show and tell stuff with the paper. Have you seen any vaping tools at all?
When Officer Salazar, when the officers did it, they brought a few things that one day. So that was all I had seen. And then I see a guy walking in my neighborhood with a fairly good sized one.
Have you heard of the Juul?
Yeah, I saw it online, but I haven't seen it in person.
When I first wanted to purchase some of this for show and tell, I wanted to know how easy it was to get it. So I got online, and I found that that they had numerous places from all over the United States and outside the United States. And then I went to Chandler area specific. and I saw that we had 3 main vaping facilities, and I clicked onto order, and all I had to do was click a button that said I was 18, and I was in. Then I just needed to be able to pay by PayPal or just put a credit card in there, and I could buy anything I wanted from all of their vaping tools to all of their products that contain nicotine. They contain no nicotine, 3%, 10%, 12%. I think it even goes up to 16. Maybe stops at 12. But you could purchase all of these items just by a click, and it would be shipped to your house.
Is that the one that's about the size of a thumb drive?
Yeah, this is the most common. They call it a Joule, and it looks like,
Yeah.
just like it's a USB. In fact, in order to charge it, all vaping products have coils that heat up the vaping material, causing the vape. So all of them have to have some kind of ability to be electronically charged. This one uses a USB port. So it looks just like a USB, so if somebody was walking around with this, you wouldn't think, really, that could be something to smoke out of. Here is the mechanism that you plug it into, and that charges it. These are the cartridges, the preloaded cartridges that come with it, and this one, I'll let you see that too. That one is a mixed berry or a berry or something along that line, or it's fruit medley. I knew it had something to do with fruit. When I went into the vaping store to buy this stuff, and I didn't really know what I was doing. I asked for a Joule. I said, "Do you have a Joule starter kit?" And the guy said, "Yeah, what flavor you want?" And I said, "Well, what do you have?" And he points at a list, and there was like 50 different options. So then I said, "Well, what's your most popular?" And he said, "This one." But it just showed me that there's just such a variety that you can get. This is called a mod.
That's the
And,
one I've seen with
the mods will have the capacity to give a bigger vape. And when you have a e-cigarette, this is an e-cigarette, or a mod, now you can put in your own fluid. So if I'm going to put in my own fluid in here in this side, this is the way that if somebody wanted to introduce some kind of THC or some kind of mind-altering component, they can take it and directly put that right in there, vape it, and when a product is heated up, it like expands the content. So if it was like a 3%, if it's heated up, then it can expand that to a higher level. And Dr. Bogosh will explain a little more about that in the content.
Is it more dangerous or not?
I
mean, can it burn your lungs?
I'll let Dr. Bogash explain that to you, because the answer is yes. In layman's terms, it's yes. It does damage your lungs, and I'll let him explain some of the finer points of how that happens. He has so much more knowledge in that than I do. And just a couple other points just to kind of throw out there. There have been studies now, like I say, it's going to take years to put a lot of data together, but there's been enough studies to kind of show tendencies. One of the ones that I thought was interesting was a study that showed that one of the reasons why vaping came into being was supposed to assist people to stop smoking, so they could reduce the nicotine and then therefore taper off. It showed that individuals that did engage into vaping did not increase in their level of cigarette smoking, but it didn't show a great number of them decreasing. But what it did show is that individuals that have never smoked, that vaped, there was a rise in now a nicotine, a regular smoking habit. So they went from never smoking, now I'm vaping, to now I'm smoking. So it's kind of a gateway that the data is showing that it was a gateway that now people have developed a smoking nicotine intake habit.
So now we've got more kids
So
actually
now you
addicted
got more
than
people,
others just
more kids, more people. I was talking to a young lady, we had Mother's Day at our house, and one of one of the young men that is connected to our family brought his girlfriend over. And we got on the subject of vapes. And she got really interested, and she said, she said, was my experience. She said, I started smoking at 16 because, it was a cool thing to do, and then pretty soon I went from a cigarette to 2 cigarettes, so I had a full, addiction to smoking. She said, I tried vapes to get off of cigarettes. She said, but I wasn't getting the same, she called it a head high. She said, it wasn't giving me the same sensation as smoking. She said, and I found that I was vaping and vaping and vaping to try to get to the point where 1 or 2 cigarettes would get me to. She said, so I had to stop the vaping, and I had to finally just decide to quit. So it was just interesting to me that she was validating some of these studies that came out that said that she tried to use vaping to quit, but it just didn't prove to be effective for her, because it just didn't meet the same thing that she said in her mind that I was correlating. Maybe Dr. Bogash can, if he has time, can kind of throw some scientific or evidentiary value into why the mind was not reading that the same as a cigarette. But with that, Dr. Bogash, would you mind coming up and providing some of the inside information?
Hey, remember when e-cigarettes first came out, they were literally like a cigarette. You'd suck on them and they would light up on the end. They were just really designed to duplicate that sensation. So, what time do we have? Okay, so plenty of time. So to give you an idea of my background, my name is Dr. James Bogash. I'm a chiropractic physician over in Mesa. I've been in practice 20 years now. And for almost that entire 20 years, I've managed to read on the range about 120 medical journals a month, always looking for things related to natural medicine, wellness care, disease prevention. Physiology, or the way the body works, is my passion. And unfortunately, there's a huge gap between what we know in the research and what happens in the typical doctor's office. So part of what I do in the community is to bridge the gap. And I've had a medical blog since before they called it a blog. So it wasn't quite on paper, but I'm going for slide. So what we'll look at first 2 slides, I'll look at heavy metals. And clearly heavy metals are something we want to have as little as possible in our body. There are, the problem is that the coils are made up of heavy metal, as well as some of the joints that are used, some of the soldering in there. So we've got heavy metals that hit things like iron, chromium, aluminum, nickel, in a different brand, more chromium, tin is used in the joints. These heavy metals are known to have neurotoxicity, so problems with the neurologic system, cardiovascular problems, respiratory disease, lung cancer for a certain form of chromium and nickel. Basically, we want to have as little exposure to heavy metals as possible, and it is clear that heavy metals have a detrimental effect on our health. Pick an organ system, it may be the lungs, it may be the brain, it may be the kidneys, it may be the heart, but heavy metals are not good for us. So there were some researchers that decided to start looking at, well, these coils, are the heavy metals coming off in the coils? Especially a lot of these coils that are coming over from China. Those generally an inferior product, and they're more likely to kick off some of these heavy metals. But they found that if the coil, some of the devices have the coil sitting inside the solution. When that happens, then the amount of heavy metal in the vapor becomes higher because it's basically soaking in there. Any heavy metals have a chance to break into the solution, or to dissolve into the solution. So they found a long list of heavy metals, things like aluminum, nickel, lead, chromium, zinc. What else we got? Antimony, cadmium, arsenic. More than 50% of the samples they checked exceeded the current health-based limits for the heavy metals chromium, manganese, nickel, and lead. So clearly, what's coming off in the aerosol and we're inhaling is making it into our systems, and these levels are high enough to be known to be documented to have health effects. The other interesting thing is then we start looking at secondhand. Think of secondhand smoke. We don't think of secondhand vaping because it dissipates quite rapidly. However, most of us probably know that one of the reasons we take off, like when you come to the house, we take off our shoes, is because heavy metals have a tendency to ride in on dust particles. Lead, cadmium are notorious for coming in. So if we take our shoes off at the door, we're less likely to bring that dust into the house. The dust gets kicked up, we inhale it, and it makes it into our lungs and in our system. So what's likely to happen with vaping is these heavy metals that are coming off are going to settle in the environment, especially like in your car, and if you're in home or on your clothing, and then it's just going to reintroduce that exposure as those dust particles come off whenever they happen to land on. So clearly something that we hadn't thought about before. People are thinking about what's in the vape solution, and we will certainly talk about that, but just the device itself increases our risk of health exposures. So this particular study looked at the Cigalites. They were the first generation, looked like typical cigarettes. Tank-style devices with different voltages, because the voltages can be ramped up. Some of them are adjustable, some of them are at a fixed voltage. So what happens at a higher voltage versus a lower voltage? We already talked about secondhand exposure. And it's not just what it settles on. If you happen to breathe somebody else's vape, it's likely that you're going to be exposed to these heavy metals. So we see that clearly the emission rates were higher in e-cigarettes for certain heavy metals. What was interesting is for lead and zinc, they were found in concentrations that were similar to that found in cigarette smoking, some of the samples. So cigarette smoking, combustible cigarettes, are well known to increase our exposure to certain heavy metals. Cadmium is one of the ones that I always think of. Cadmium is very toxic to the kidneys. It's one of the reasons why cigarette smokers have problems with their kidneys over the long run. It's because of the cadmium in them. But we're finding that the vaping solution, the aerosol, has heavy metals that are comparable to that in cigarette smoke. So we're not escaping, it's not any type of a safer mechanism. As would make sense, the higher voltage means you're going to consume more e-liquid, you're going to go through it much faster, so your exposure to that is going to be increased. And we'll talk about aldehyde emissions, but there's some volatile compounds that actually triple when the voltages went higher. When you have higher voltages, you have more, that's where you're going to see those huge plumes of vape, or for the car in front of you or somebody walking by, that you'll see the plume of vape that comes out. And those are generally higher voltage. Other things that made a factor: the age of the device. So the older the device, the more likely it is to break down. The temperature at which it's stored, vaping regimen. So taking a single puff on a vape is going to have less exposure than having 10 or 15 vapes. So, and again, the more that vape, it's not even the age of the device. If somebody's vaping more frequently, it's going to break down the device more readily. Next slide. So then we'll look at volatile compounds. So volatile compounds are, gasoline is probably one of the ones that everybody's familiar with. And there's reasons why we have safety tools around, like dispensing gasoline, because when we absorb those, they are readily absorbed across the lung, and they create lots of potential problems. So we look at volatile compounds. This particular study looked at 16-year-olds, so we're looking at the high school population. They looked at the urine for metabolites of things that I could probably pronounce if somebody had a gun to my head, but clearly these are things that we don't want in our body. And if we're finding them in the urine, it means that these things are making it through the respiratory system, getting absorbed, having their effects throughout the body, and then ending up in the urine once they've done their damage. Interestingly enough, these volatile compounds were higher only in e-cigarette users, not in traditional combustible smokers. And so the authors concluded, this was a study in pediatrics, and just last month, by the way, all of the research from here is all the past 3 to 6 months. There's a lot of research on it, but we don't have a whole lot prior to that, because this is the uptake, and really just, it was an onslaught of use. Ted covered some of the increased incidence of vaping, but from a research standpoint, it takes time to design studies, to fund studies, to produce the studies, and then to publish the studies, years even. So the fact that we've gotten some of these off the ground in a short period of time, and none of them are favorable. every one we've seen that have been published in the past 6 months has not been favorable on the health effects. So the authors concluded that while e-cigarette vapor is less hazardous than tobacco smoke, e-cigarette vapor is not safe, and many of the VOCs are carcinogenic. And it may not just be lung cancer we're talking about now, it may be cancer at other sites of the body. That would totally make sense, because these things are making it everywhere. They're showing up in the urine, so they're having their effect on every organ system. Interestingly enough, Ted mentioned a little bit about how much we're finding that vaping is a gateway to combustible smoking. The idea is, well, we'll just vape and then we won't. I think maybe that we get used to this idea of taking things in our lungs, and it's okay. Now all of a sudden we've been doing it with e-cigarettes, and now all of a sudden it's a cigarette. It's not a big jump versus I'm not going to put anything in my lungs that's not supposed to be there, and hey, let's try the cigarette smoke and my lungs react violently. That tells you something that maybe it's not a good idea. So I think some of that makes sense. So in this particular study, again, this was just in January in pediatrics of this year. They kind of broke it up between the years to 2000, but basically it went anywhere from 387% to 700% increased risk of vapors taking up combustible smoking, and these were on high school students. So if anything, we've actually created an environment where we have more smokers than ever before. And for the first time in generations, we've seen the incidence of cigarette smoking going down. Finally learning to understand and control this monster. And now I'm sure that as we start seeing some of the incidence studies, we may even climb up higher than we ever were before, because vaping has been so widely accepted and accepted as safe. Interesting enough, there are times that when people have health conditions and they think they're protected, they may make worse behavioral decisions. The best example I can give is statins to lower cholesterol. It's well documented that people on statins eat more saturated fat, they exercise less, because they think that they're protected, and clearly it doesn't help them by doing that, and their best bet is to make the lifestyle choices. But this was a particular study looking at asthmatics. You'd think that asthmatics already have a very sensitive respiratory system. We probably shouldn't do anything to aggravate that. And yet in this particular study, we found that the asthmatic teens were actually slightly more likely than non-asthmatic teens to vape. Difference between about a 2% increase. But it just doesn't even make sense. We already have a respiratory problem, and then we're taking in things in our lungs that are known to aggravate a respiratory situation. So the authors looked at this, and they kind of broke everything down about why it's bad in the first place, why it's super bad in asthmatics, and yet, despite this, asthmatics are smoking more than their non-asthmatic, or are vaping more than their non-asthmatic counterparts. Maybe it's because they think that this is safer, that it's safe, so I can do this, and I'm not going to challenge my lungs, and almost like, I don't know, can't figure out the thought process with that. So the authors point out that our occupational inhalation of some common food-safe flavoring agents known to cause occupational asthma and worsen asthmatic symptoms. The one that most people point out is the diacetyl, the fact that's in the flavoring of microwave popcorn, and you have popcorn lung. A lot of vapors will say, well, the levels are way higher in the factory workers as opposed to what you're absorbing in the vaping. Well, the problem is we're still absorbing it. It doesn't matter how much. It may have lower levels of the diacetyl aldehydes, but it's going to have much higher levels of everything else that microwave popcorn would not have. So there's the diacetyl, irreversible, that causes irreversible obstructive airway disease. In other words, you're damaging the lining of the cells lining the respiratory tract that you can't ever recover from. So what's interesting is when we start breaking down, because there's heat applied to this solution, when you break down propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin, these are two of the compounds that people go, well, it's just a little propylene glycol, it's vegetable glycerin, so it's vegetable, so it's got to be good. Produces what they're called reactive carbonyls, including, again, more compounds, even though most people would probably recognize formaldehyde These are known lung irritants. So the initial compound may be okay, but then when we superheat it and inhale it through the coil, these are known respiratory things known to irritate the respiratory tract. What's going to be interesting is that propylene glycol, vegetable glycerin, and the flavoring chemicals all have lung effects that are not usually seen in cigarette smokers. So in other words, we are opening up an entire new Pandora's box of problems that we don't have any idea what they're going to be. Even though clearly, knowing that we're exposing the lung to toxic chemicals, there's going to be a price to be paid. We just don't know what it is yet. Whether it would be lung cancer, whether it would be destruction of the lining of the cells, whether we would start seeing more things, absorbing more things through the respiratory tract than we're supposed to. One of the things to understand, and again, this was one in 2017 October. This is probably one of the earliest ones, or the oldest ones I can find. What's interesting is that talked about how much gap there is in medical knowledge from the research, and we are now starting to understand that the respiratory tract is not sterile, not even close. So the idea of having a respiratory infection doesn't make any more sense than having a gut infection, because everybody knows we got all kinds of bacteria living in our gut. Well, we're starting to understand that the respiratory and urinary tract are not sterile either, and that asthma and allergies may actually just be a disruption of what bacteria are supposed to be there. So now what's going to happen is we have these compounds, superheated compounds and flavoring agents. Not only they're going to affect the tissue, but they're probably going to affect the makeup of the bacteria in our lungs. And as anybody who's had 20 or 30 years of gut problems will tell you, it can be very difficult to recover from when things get off kilter with our microbiome, our balance of our bacteria. So expect those problems down the line with respiratory systems. This one I find probably the most interesting and probably the most scary is anytime our cells are exposed to things, they will react. And one of the things that we can look at in the cells is what kind of proteins are they producing, or are they producing proteins? It's the way that our cells respond to our environment. And in this particular case, a group of researchers, European Respiratory Journal, again, February 2008. So they looked at the lung cells of vapors, smokers, and non-smokers under the microscope. And what they found is that a vapor's airways that appeared friable and erythematous, basically damaged and red. So clearly, the vaping was irritating the lining to the point where they were inflamed and started to become more and more damaged. In the cells lining the lungs, they found over 300 proteins that were produced in both smokers and vapors. Makes sense. The body's trying to respond to these toxicants that it's being exposed to. Only 78% of the proteins were the same in smokers and vapors. And 113 were uniquely altered in vapors. In other words, these cells are responding to chemicals they're being exposed to in an entirely different way than we have any history or knowledge of in the past. We can't compare them to cigarette smokers. It's a brand new set of problems that we are introducing. They did find that the e-liquids rapidly actually entered the cells. So, and the other thing is that propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin reduced membrane fluidity and impaired protein diffusion. In other words, it starts to affect when we take in a breath, we absorb the oxygen. We absorb some other things. We absorb water. We can release water and lung vapor. But it's a very specific barrier. We only want things getting in that are supposed to get in. And these compounds were starting to disrupt that. So that means that a vapor, I'm not saying that you should wrap your lips around the muffler of a 1978 Ford Granada, but if a vapor did that and a non-smoker, non-vapor did that, they would absorb less of those toxins from that exhaust than would the vapor. The vapor would now absorb more of them because that barrier is starting to break down. So the authors concluded that chronic vaping exerts marked biological effects on the lung, and that these effects may in part be mediated by the propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin base. In other words, there are significant undesirable changes that are occurring as a result of the vaping. Last slide, I found this one very interesting as well, and this probably goes back to the idea that we have a lung flora, a bacterial flora that's growing in our lungs, and if we change those, it will increase our exposure to infection as well. So in this one, again, this was in February of this year, they found that nicotine-containing and nicotine-free e-cigarette vapor increased pneumococcal adhesion to airway cells. In other words, nicotine had nothing to do with it. It was the vaping, active vaping, that increased their likelihood of bacteria that cause pneumonia attaching and creating an infection. So what we'll start seeing is that, if we do the studies, that vapors are more likely to develop respiratory infections. We go back to the asthmatics. It's never a good thing. And I think some of that may have to do with changing the microbiome, the bacterial makeup of the respiratory tract. And again, recovering from that can take a long time. The other thing I didn't have in there, this was a study just from, I think within the past week and a half, and it was looking at oxidative stress. So in other words, most of us are familiar with antioxidants like vitamin C and vitamin A and how they protect us from oxidative damage. I usually describe oxidative damage as smoke. Our bodies produce fire to make things work, to make enzymes work, to function, but as a result, there's a byproduct of producing that energy, and I call it smoke. Those are free radicals, and when they get out of control, they're called oxidative stress. Oxidative stress has pretty much been linked to any chronic disease you can fill in the blank. Cancer, heart disease, diabetes, osteoporosis, you name it, it plays a role. And so in this study, they found that the flavoring agents, so now we're not talking about the propylene glycol or the vegetable glycerin, the flavoring agents were inducing a significant amount of oxidative stress in the lung cells. So again, yet another study looking at a different parameter, a different compound that's in these vapes that are known to irritate the lungs. And the problem then is by the time we find out what exactly these things will do, it will already be too late. In many cases, the damage will be done. It's kind of like cigarette smokers. Even if they quit, they have a lifetime residual increased risk of lung cancer. It's just the consequence of damaging the lungs for that long. So that's it on all the fun, exciting stuff about how safe vaping is. Any questions?
Do you think in the long run, it's going to be harder to get kids off of vaping versus cigarette smoking?
I think if we just look at them and go, hey, this ain't good for you, it's not going to help. I mean, how many overweight diabetics do we have eating donuts and drinking diet soda? Clearly, they know it's not good for them. I think we can probably start, I don't want to throw out an entire generation, but start educating in our elementary schools and our parents so that they can say, hey, this is not safe. Because society is not promoting that idea yet. Until we do, we won't be able to stop people vaping. Because I think the biggest uptake is because people think it's safe. Like that idea that it's just, Ted, what did you say? That the kids just think it's
Shiny new object?
well, not the shiny new, but
Oh,
she
it's
said
cool. It's
but that they're inhaling, that it's just like flavoring or
they just think that they're inhaling flavored water.
flavored water. It's some of that idea, and it's clearly not the case. And I think that may be some of the reasons why we have the uptake, is that we have no idea that of everything that's involved and that's being inhaled. So I don't know. Education is certainly a part of it. Once somebody has started, I think clearly if we start to educate kids, there will be a chunk of the very smart ones that will say, wow, this just isn't worth it to me. As far as the habits, we've talked at the parent that there are kids vaping in class, that they're just blowing down their shirt or blowing down their sleeve. And there's a reason why they're doing that. And until we can identify what the reason is, because it's probably not the nicotine. It may be a calming effect, in which case you chew gum or something something like that. But I don't have an answer for what's going to happen. I just know that these compounds clearly are not as safe as everybody thinks that they are.
You know, we're giving kids Chromebooks, and so now these little thumb drive
Yeah.
things, they're charging their vaping pens on their school-issued Chromebooks. I mean, you know.
Ted didn't show up, but he has some really nasty pictures of
We can pull 'em up.
explosions.
Yeah, go ahead. And explain what happens when.
Well, I saw that in the, like
In the
in the
handout,
airplane,
yeah.
they don't want them in your checked baggage, but they want them underneath the plane. Why is that?
As a matter of fact, one of the persons watching the video is a flight attendant. She said that there's grave concerns with the potentially explosive nature of, what was it, that it was like the Samsung 6 or something
Yeah.
like that they, and so, you know, the incidence is not that, but it clearly can happen. And so these are some pretty nasty photos of explosion. I mean, think about where it is when these things go off. Same thing with your cell phone, if you had that there, it was right by your ear. Like, hopefully you were just texting it with your
I
hand.
think there's a couple more slides of pictures. And since they're a charging agent that's combustible, it has a probability to explode. So when they explode, this is what we have seen as
Not very.
damage.
No, not at all.
Who needs teeth anyway?
Or your tongue.
Or your tongue, or your cheeks. I mean,
You know, when I was in junior high, I remember a guy coming and doing our science class. And he came and he had a trach